If I come across a camera thief today, I've had it. Hopefully that doesn't happen. This video is sponsored by MPB. I usually start these videos by saying the words, "Hello everybody," but multiple viewers for this video might be a stretch because what we're going to talk about is, well, it's quite niche. I do get asked about it a lot though, so maybe we will get 2 or 3. We'll see. So, as a result of sort of blind luck and your continued generosity in watching my videos, perhaps not this one, but my other videos, I have been fortunate enough to acquire some quite premium cameras. And as a result, I'm often asked the differences in the files between the Sony A7R5, the Leica Q3 43, and the Hasselblad X2D. And for full transparency to the 3 of you watching, the Sony and the Leica I bought with my own money. The Hasselblad was given to me by Hasselblad in exchange for me making a video with the camera in the Faroe Islands last year. Have that removed. And based on how much X2D content there is around currently, I don't think I was the only photographer to take them up on that offer. Now, if I was going to make a video about image quality, I could end it really quite quickly. If you want the best image quality, get the Hasselblad. 100 megapixels, much bigger sensor than these 2 full frame cameras. End of. The thing is, for me, all 3 of these cameras give me more resolution, dynamic range, low light performance than I will ever need. And so I've got no interest at all really in looking at the image quality differences that might exist between them. And yes, the Hasselblad is a step up in what we typically define as image quality. But what I'm more interested in is the more subtle differences in characteristics of the files, if there are any. And that's the purpose of me shooting several different scenes with all 3 of these cameras, to see if we can learn what those differences might be. Now, there are a few ways that we could do this. We could look at the raw files, which I don't particularly want to do because raw files are designed to be edited. And as a consequence, we could just take a standardized preset, apply that to all the images, and then make our assessments from there. But I don't think that's particularly fair because that standardized preset might favor certain tone or color characteristics of particular files. And so really, I think the best way to do this is for me to take each image from each camera, from each scene, edit it to a point where I'm happy with it, and then look at each of the scenes individually across the 3 images and try to spot patterns between each of the cameras across each of the scenes. Is my plan. I hope you're still with me. Probably down to 1 viewer now. And let's start by doing something I suggested we shouldn't do, which is to look at unedited raw photos. Actually, they are edited. I've got rid of the vignettes already, but apart from that, these are unedited. And the reason that I want to look at these is if you take a look at the Hasselblad shot in the top left, and I appreciate that you're watching a compressed YouTube video and looking at tiny files, I'll perhaps put together a blog post, which I'll link to in the description, and it might give a better sense of what these photos actually look like. But yeah, you might have to trust me if you can't really tell the differences in these files. But the Hasselblad shot, top left, is a different shape to the others. That's because the Hasselblad sensor is a 4x3 sensor, and the full frame Leica and the full frame Sony, they are 3x2, obviously. And so, even though all of these photos were shot at 43mm, mostly because the Leica has a fixed 43mm lens, and so on the Sony I shot at 43mm, and on the Hasselblad I used the 55mm lens, which full frame equivalent is 43mm, the Hasselblad files on the sides look tighter. And that's just because the sensor is a different shape. You have more room at the top and bottom on a 4x3 sensor, less room at the sides. And the second thing to point out on these mostly unedited files is that the bottom shot, the Leica, has a slightly weird white balance setting. And I don't know if it's just my copy of the Q3 43, but basically if I'm pointing the camera anywhere other than where I want to shoot, and then I point it where I want to shoot, the white balance takes a little while to adjust. And so I can fire off a few shots that won't have the correct white balance before it adjusts properly. Not really a problem because I'm shooting raw, but I just wanted to point that out before we start looking at edited files. How long have we been going? Oh dear, not looked at any edited photos yet. Let's do that. Right, so these files are edited, and the first thing I should say is that they are similar enough in terms of their editing characteristics that should you want to, it would be pretty simple, so long as you know how to edit and you know how colour works, to make them all look pretty much identical. But that's not the aim of the game today. What I really want to find out is if I was to only take out one camera at a time, what are the differences between the final edited shots that I'm happy with between each of the cameras. And I can see straight away, in this example at least, that the Hasselblad, again, these photos are in the same places and they always will be, so the Hasselblad top left, Sony top right, Leica down at the bottom. There is a big difference between the Hasselblad and the Leica shots in particular. The Hasselblad shot is quite sort of, I'd say there's lots of magenta in it and the shadows are very, very cold. The Leica shot is much, much warmer. The shadows are warmer. There's a lot more cyan in this photo. And I'd also say the shadows are sort of softer and more faded. And the Sony sits somewhere between the two, and I would suggest has probably the most contrast. Now this, as an observation, is worthless because it's one photo, one scene. What I'm interested in is, do any of these characteristics carry over to other scenes? So let us look at some other scenes. Files in the same places again. You will note that they are all the same shape because in this one, on the Hasselblad shot, I've cropped it to 3x2. And when you crop an X2D shot to 3x2, you still have 90 megapixels, which is quite funny. I should say I've probably done the Sony dirty in this example because I shot the Sony image at a time when there was no cloud coming over, which makes the other shots a little bit more interesting, I think. Other than that, they are the same scene. Actually, there is another reason that the Sony is at a disadvantage. I was not only shooting on a zoom compared to the other two cameras that are shooting primes, so it's a good job I'm not focusing on image quality. People are going mad about that. But also on the Sony, I didn't use a lens hood, which is the reason the wall down here looks a bit washed out and less contrasty compared to the rest of the shot. You won't see that problem on the other two because I was using a lens hood. Absolute incompetence. Least scientific video you'll ever watch. But aside from those small mishaps, I'm seeing the same thing. The Hasselblad has quite a lot of magenta in it. If you look at this roof up here on the Hasselblad, there's lots of magenta there that just isn't there on the Leica. There's also less contrast on the Leica shot, and again, there's much more cyan in this photo. And the Sony, in terms of contrast, looks much more like the Hasselblad shot, just with slightly less magenta. And that is potentially interesting because that's two shots now. Is that the start of a pattern? Now I did stay at this scene for quite a while longer, until sunset basically, but cloud cover started coming over and it made getting three similar shots quite tricky because clouds would come over for 10 seconds, then you'd get sun again, cloud, sun, cloud, sun, cloud. Got a bit tricky. So I decided to go to a different location in completely different conditions the next morning. And what we've got, I'd say, is pretty similar results. The Hasselblad again has lots of magenta in it. The Leica has none, much more cyan, bit less contrast, and the Sony sits somewhere in the middle. Interesting. Now again, it's not necessarily a reflection on the files themselves. These can all be edited and manipulated massively because they're such detailed files. But it's interesting that the finished article I arrive at on each of these cameras is, to my eye at least, different. I find that really interesting. Let's look at this cottage from the other side. Maybe slightly less obvious here, but the Hasselblad again does have some magenta that's just not there in the Leica file. And yeah, the Sony sits somewhere in the middle. Yeah, this is definitely a pattern now, and definitely characteristics of the files, or at least how I'm choosing to edit the files. Last scene. This was quite a tricky one to shoot and therefore quite a good test subject because the light was getting pretty harsh. And this is probably where the differences and the patterns I've been talking about are most pronounced. The Hasselblad file looks very full of magenta, the Leica file has lots of cyan, and the Sony file is very neutral, and to my eye is the nicest looking one. And I think that has been the case across all these examples. My favourite has been the Sony. And that's probably not particularly interesting to you three watching. What do you care what I prefer? But what is interesting is that the result that you end up with, or the result I've ended up with, is different for each of the cameras, which suggests, should I only take one camera out, I'll end up with different results than if I'd taken a different camera out. And provided there are at least 3 people watching, there's a good chance that not everyone thinks the Sony files are best. You might like the Hasselblad or the Leica files more. And in that case, budget allowing, it would perhaps make sense to choose these cameras accordingly. But for me, I suppose I've got to ask myself, if I prefer the Sony files pretty much every time, why would I ever take a Leica out or a Hasselblad? Because it's definitely not for file characteristics. Anyway, thanks to both of you for watching this far into the video. I really appreciate it. And thank you also to MPB for sponsoring this video. Now perhaps you're sat at home thinking, oh, I've got multiple cameras, perhaps I should do this test with mine. And maybe you find that, like me, you have a preference for one of the camera's files over the other. And well, if then you decide to sell some of your kit, I would highly recommend you do so on MPB. It's super quick to get a quote on their website, and if you're happy with that quote, MPB can arrange for a courier to come to your front door to collect your gear. Once they receive it, they'll assess it, confirm your quote, and pay you very quickly. It's so much simpler than selling privately. And likewise, if you're in the market to expand your camera gear, MPB is always the first place I check. I have saved thousands over the years by buying from MPB, and often when I buy something that's listed as like new, the lens or camera will arrive and it'll look like it's literally never been used despite costing significantly less. And when you buy from MPB, everything comes with a 6-month warranty, and you can buy safe in the knowledge that every item has been assessed by an expert before being listed on the site. So whether you're looking to add to your kit or reduce your kit, definitely check out MPB, and a massive thank you to them for their continued support of this channel. Now I'm going to sit here and mull over the fact that after years of finding my Sony cameras incredibly boring and really not bonding with them at all, it turns out I'm actually really starting to like them. That is much more interesting than I thought this would be. It is a shame that nobody will watch this video. Never mind.